Harwell, Berkshire. January 24th, 1950, 10 in the morning. The office is unremarkable. No photographs, no decoration. Just a desk, 2 chairs, a blackboard covered in equations, and a window onto a grey English January. The man who writes those equations has never once left them visible overnight. His name is Klaus Fuchs, 38 years old, head of the Theoretical Physics Division at the Atomic Energy Research Establishment. Highest security clearance in the British nuclear program. One of the finest theoretical minds of his generation. He has also been passing the West's most sensitive nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union for 9 years. The man across from him is William Skardon, MI5. The best interviewer in British intelligence, not because he is aggressive, but because he understands that a patient silence is the most dangerous thing you can put in a room. He has a notepad, he has a pen, he has no evidence that would hold in court. He cannot make Fuchs talk. Fuchs looks at him across the desk, and then he says, "I want to tell you something." He will talk for 4 sessions over the following 3 weeks, 9 years of espionage, described with the same methodical clarity he has always brought to physics. He will name his American handler. He will leave almost nothing out. He is not doing this because Skardon has outmaneuvered him. He is not doing this because the evidence is irresistible. He is doing this because 12 weeks ago, something inside him broke. The answer, when it finally comes, will have nothing to do with William Skardon. It will have everything to do with the morning in New Mexico 4 years earlier, when Klaus Fuchs sat alone in a government jeep, completely alone, 10 miles from ground zero, by his own request, and watched his own equation become light. He watched it. He noted the yield data. He drove back to the laboratory and went to work. He felt he would say years later, nothing in particular. That nothing is where this story actually begins. The man with 2 rooms inside him. Klaus Fuchs was born in 1911 in Rüsselsheim, Germany. His father was a Lutheran pastor who became a Quaker, a man who changed his theology publicly and accepted the consequences, who taught his children that a conviction you won't act on is not a conviction at all. The son absorbed this completely. He simply applied it to different convictions. He arrived at the University of Leipzig in 1930, just as Germany came apart. Unemployment above 30%. Weimar collapsing. Communist and fascist paramilitaries killing each other in the streets. Fuchs looked at what was happening, looked at what Marxist analysis said was happening, and concluded the analysis was correct. He joined the Communist Party of Germany in 1930, not as a gesture, but the way he would later approach a physics problem. Read everything, test every assumption, commit to the conclusion. Hitler became Chancellor on January 30th, 1933. The Reichstag burned 4 weeks later. His name appeared on a Nazi list within days. He crossed into France with the clothes he was wearing and nothing else. He eventually reached England. He earned a PhD. He continued doing physics. He continued in a compartment he never opened in company, being a communist. His colleagues described him in identical terms: silent at social gatherings, uncomfortable with small talk, but possessed of a quality of attention that was unlike anything they had encountered. The pattern was consistent enough that accounts of him have crystallized around a single image. Sitting in the corner of a Los Alamos gathering in 1944, saying nothing for 2 hours, then walking across the room to tell Oppenheimer he had found an error in the implosion lens calculations. Not dramatically, the way someone mentions they noticed you dropped something, then going back to his corner. The office at the beginning of this episode tells you something Fuchs never said in words. No photographs, no decoration. Just equations on a blackboard, erased every single night without fail. A man who left no trace of himself anywhere he worked. A man who had learned that the safest thing you can do with what you actually are is make sure no surface reflects it. He could hold 2 complete and internally consistent value systems simultaneously, the physicist who believed in rigorous empirical testing, and the communist who had committed to a political framework, and maintained them in separate rooms inside his head. He would later describe this in the most precise phrase he ever used about himself, as a controlled schizophrenia. A man with 2 rooms inside him and walls between them that he had spent years making strong. The derivation: Birmingham, 1941. The contact was a woman named Ruth Kuczynski, codename Sonia. She had been running Soviet agents in Britain since the late 1930s, operating from a rented cottage in Oxfordshire, while presenting to her neighbors as an ordinary German refugee with 2 small children. Fuchs met her in Birmingham in the summer of 1941. A street corner, a brief walk, a handoff that took less time than buying a newspaper. He handed her material from the British atomic weapons program, tube alloys, the precursor to the Manhattan Project, technical notes written in a hand so small and precise that the pages looked at a distance like printed text. He would be asked many times what he felt in that moment. Guilt, fear, conflict. He described none of them. He described a logical conclusion. Britain and the United States were developing a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. The Soviet Union was an ally dying at a rate that made Western casualties look negligible. If it did not have equivalent knowledge, it would emerge from the war permanently disadvantaged, not because of anything it had done wrong, but because the relevant physicists happened to be in the relevant universities at the relevant time. This asymmetry had no moral justification. Correcting it was, therefore, correct. Not a moral position, an analysis. The Cambridge Five, Philby, Burgess, McLean, Blunt, Cairncross, had been recruited as young men and spent decades holding a position they had chosen in their 20s. You can argue with the position. Fuchs had not chosen a position. He had derived one. The same mind that made him irreplaceable at Los Alamos made his commitment to Moscow unshakable. You cannot argue someone out of a conclusion they reached by thinking. You can only wait for the evidence to turn. The Mesa, Los Alamos, 1944. The Manhattan Project's primary laboratory was built on a remote mesa in New Mexico. So secret its mailing address was a post office box in Santa Fe. So saturated with talent that Oppenheimer compared it to a city that existed for 1 year and changed everything. Fuchs arrived in August 1944. His responsibility: the hydrodynamics of implosion, calculating how precisely shaped explosive lenses could compress a plutonium core into a perfect sphere in the microseconds before it destroyed itself. There were perhaps 5 people in the world capable of the work. Fuchs was one of them. His American handler was a man he knew only as Raymond. Raymond's real name was Harry Gold, a chemist from Philadelphia, unremarkable in every dimension that didn't involve what he was willing to carry across a parking lot. He took the subway to his legitimate job and brought his lunch in a paper bag. Their meetings in Santa Fe were brief. Fuchs would drive in on a weekend pass. Gold would be at the agreed corner. Fuchs handed over what he had prepared. Gold confirmed the previous delivery, minutes, start to finish. What he handed over was the bomb, not a summary, the implosion lens geometry, the initiator specifications, the critical mass calculations, the precise yield estimates. If you wanted to build what Los Alamos was building, Klaus Fuchs had given you what you needed. He handed it across a parking lot to a man with a paper bag. Then he drove back and went to work. The morning it worked, July 16th, 1945. Fuchs drove alone. Everyone else at Trinity watched in groups. Scientists, officers, observers pressed together in the pre-dawn dark of the New Mexico desert, sharing the anxiety of people who have calculated that something will happen, but cannot be entirely certain until it does. Whether Fuchs observed alone or with others, the accounts of his character at Los Alamos suggest he would have wanted the distance. The official record places him among the British mission observers. What the record does not preserve is what he was thinking. He parked 10 miles from ground zero, and waited in the dark. The desert in July before dawn is cold enough that you can see your breath. He had a clipboard. He had instruments. He had the stillness of a man whose mind is doing something even when his body is not. At 5:29:45 on the morning of July 16, 1945, the Trinity device detonated. The flash reached him before the sound did. The darkness became white, total, absolute, instant, in a way that the word flash does not capture because a flash implies brevity, and this did not feel brief. It felt like the world had changed state, like darkness was a thing that had existed and now did not. The fireball rose. The shockwave arrived 40 seconds after the light and rocked the jeep. The sound came after that. Not like an explosion, not like thunder, not like anything that English or German or any language had a word for, because nothing that made this sound had ever existed before this morning. Then silence. Fuchs sat in the jeep with his clipboard and looked at what he had helped make. He had solved the lens geometry, the compression mathematics, the initiator timing. He also knew that 6 months earlier he had given those calculations to Harry Gold in a Santa Fe parking lot, and that they had made their way to Moscow, and that Moscow was building its own version of what he was looking at. He understood all of this simultaneously. He noted the yield data. He drove back to the laboratory. He went to work. He felt, he would say years later when asked directly, nothing in particular. This is not a detail to pass over. This is the detail. The controlled schizophrenia was so complete that Klaus Fuchs could watch the product of his betrayal detonate over the New Mexico desert, alone in silence with no one else present to perform composure for, and feel nothing in particular. The rooms were still separate. The walls were still holding. What the bomb became. In August 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first nuclear device. American analysts concluded within weeks it was not an independent Soviet design. It was the implosion device. Fat Man, the weapon that destroyed Nagasaki, reconstructed from the specifications Fuchs had passed to Gold across those Santa Fe parking lots. The American nuclear monopoly had lasted exactly 4 years. The original estimate, absent espionage, had been 10 to 15. But the cost was not only strategic. Fuchs's confession identified Harry Gold. Gold's arrest led to David Greenglass. Greenglass identified his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg. Julius and his wife Ethel were arrested, tried and executed at Sing Sing prison on June 19, 1953. Julius Rosenberg had genuinely run a Soviet network. But Ethel's direct involvement was far more marginal than the prosecution argued. The jury convicted. The judge sentenced them both to death. The Rosenbergs were executed on a Friday evening. Julius went first. Ethel went 12 minutes later. Their 2 sons, Michael and Robert, 10 and 6 years old, were orphaned by an electric chair that was turned on, in part by a confession made in a Berkshire office 3 years earlier. Hold that for a moment before we move on. 2 people died because Klaus Fuchs decided he could not go on. He knew when he sat across from Skarden and began to speak that what he said would be followed. He told Skarden everything anyway. He did not appear to have asked whether he owed honesty to the Rosenbergs. There was a third cost. After Fuchs was arrested, a security review swept through Harwell. Every physicist who had worked alongside him was reinvestigated. Clearances suspended. Careers paused. In some cases permanently. The colleague who brought you a problem on a Wednesday morning because Fuchs was the only one who could solve it, now under review. The junior researcher who had eaten lunch with him for 3 years, now under suspicion. None of them had done anything. All of them paid. The walls come down. Harwell, 1946 to 1949. After the war, Fuchs returned to England with a reputation that had only grown. He was appointed head of the theoretical physics division at Harwell and held the highest clearance in the system. He continued for a time passing information to Moscow. But something was happening, slower and harder to name: the Berlin blockade. In 1948, a deliberate strangulation of civilians, a tactic Fuchs had watched the Nazis use in Germany. The show trials in Eastern Europe, loyal officials tortured into confessing to fabricated crimes. The purges inside Soviet scientific institutions, physicists and chemists in his own field disappearing into a system with no interest in whether they were guilty. He applied the test he applied to everything. Does the evidence support the model? The model said the Soviet Union was pursuing a historically correct political program. The evidence said it was doing this. His last confirmed meeting with the Soviet handler had been 14 months earlier. He had not sought another. He told himself this was caution. He did not examine what else it might be. He continued doing physics. He continued living in the gap between what he knew and what he could not yet face. Then, on September 23, 1949, President Truman announced that the Soviet Union had detonated a nuclear device. Fuchs read the announcement at his desk. The blackboard behind him still had the previous day's equations on it. He had not yet erased them. He always erased them before he left, every night without fail, for years. On this particular morning he had come in early, before the habit could run, and the equations were still there when the news reached him. He was the only person in that building who understood with complete precision what the announcement meant. He had looked at the implosion calculations for 2 years. He knew the Soviets had not had time to derive it independently. He had given it to them. He sat at that desk for a long time. The equations stayed on the board behind him. He did not erase them that evening. The records do not say when he finally did. The wall between the rooms did not crack gradually. It came down all at once without warning, leaving rubble where there had been structure. He could not fix what he had done. He could not ungive them the bomb. He could only decide what to do next. The room where it ended. 2 scenes. Skaden came to Harwell for the first time in December 1949. Fuchs denied everything, calmly, consistently, without apparent strain. Skaden noted in his report that Fuchs had shown no visible stress indicators. He said he would come back. Fuchs said that was fine. The second meeting was January 24th. Same office, same 2 men. Skaden had obtained no new evidence. He came back because, in his professional assessment, Fuchs was a man who had something he needed to put down. He said, "I think you have something you want to tell me." Fuchs looked at him. A long moment passed. Then he said, "Yes." What followed was not dramatic. Fuchs spoke precisely, methodically, in complete sentences. His recruitment in 1941, Ruth Kuczynski, the transfer to America, the meetings in Santa Fe, Harry Gold, the paper bag, the subway, the ordinary man from Philadelphia who had carried the bomb across a parking lot in a manila envelope. He described Trinity. At the end of the session, Skaden asked, "Why are you telling me this?" Fuchs considered the question. Then he said, "I had reached a point where I knew I could not go on." Skaden wrote it down. He did not ask what "go on" meant. Perhaps he understood that the answer was longer than either of them had time for, and that the rest, the why beneath the why, was not something a notepad could contain. I had reached a point where I knew I could not go on. 8 words, the most honest thing Klaus Fuchs ever said. Why he confessed. The verdict. Historians have offered 4 explanations, and most declined to choose. This is intellectually honest. It is also a way of refusing the hardest question. Fuchs did not confess because he was caught. The Venona signal's intelligence pointing toward him was suggestive, not conclusive. Skaden had nothing that would hold in court. A man of Fuchs's intelligence could have continued denying indefinitely and walked away. He did not confess because he was pressured. Skaden was skilled but not coercive. There was no document on the table, no moment where denial became impossible. He did not confess primarily from guilt. A man who confesses from guilt says, "I am sorry for what I did." Fuchs never said this. not in interrogation, not at trial, not in any interview that followed. What the evidence actually points to is this: the confession was not a decision made in January 1950. It was the public acknowledgement of a collapse that had already occurred in September 1949. When the Soviet bomb was announced, the framework that had made 9 years of espionage coherent, the derivation he had built in 1941 and maintained through controlled schizophrenia, was destroyed, not weakened, destroyed. The derivation was wrong. Fuchs had built himself, not just his politics but his identity, on the premise that his analysis was honest, that he tested his conclusions, that he did not maintain positions the evidence had falsified. This was not separate from being a physicist. It was the same thing. And the standard applied to his own life returned a verdict he could not argue with. He went to Skardon, not to confess, to report what had already happened inside him. He was not brave. He was not repentant. He was, in the most precise sense of the word, consistent. Even at the end. Even when consistency cost him everything. The fall. The trial lasted 1 day, March 1st, 1950. The Old Bailey. He pleaded guilty. The Attorney General described in 52 minutes what Fuchs had done and what it had cost. The judge sentenced him to 14 years, the maximum the Official Secrets Act permitted, written for civil servants, not atomic physicists. Fuchs stood in the dock entirely still, not stoic, still. The stillness of a man who had already gone through the hardest part and was now simply waiting for the procedural remainder to conclude. He served 9 years. He was released in June 1959 and driven directly to an airport. He landed in East Germany the same afternoon. He went to work. He became deputy director of the Central Institute for Nuclear Physics. He published. He supervised students. He was awarded the Karl Marx Order, the highest honor East Germany could give, twice. He never publicly expressed regret. He died in January 1988 at 76. He had lived his entire post-prison life behind a wall. The wall he had tried to build inside himself had failed. The wall of the state he had served rose around him instead. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989. Klaus Fuchs had been dead for 22 months. He never saw it come down. What the controlled schizophrenic teaches. James Angleton, who appeared in the previous episode, destroyed the CIA's most important division through certainty. He knew the threat was inside. He was right about its existence and catastrophically wrong about where it lived. His certainty made the room airtight and kept it that way for a decade. Klaus Fuchs did something almost opposite and arrived at almost the same destination. He was not certain. He was divided. He built a wall between his two commitments and maintained it for 9 years. Through the war, through Los Alamos, through Trinity, through the British nuclear program. The wall worked, until the Soviet bomb test made it impossible to maintain, until the physicist's standard finally turned on the communists' framework and found it wanting, until the derivation failed its own test. He shows us what happens when a man is too intelligent to be certain, so he builds a wall instead. When compartmentalization, which is a genuine cognitive skill, is used not to manage complexity, but to avoid the collision that honesty would require. The wall worked for 9 years. When it failed completely, because walls built to prevent a collision can't be partially maintained. They're either up or they're down. Fuchs was not found at all. He found himself. The entire machinery of counterintelligence, Venona, the surveillance, the signals intelligence, produced a room. And the man in that room made his own decision about what to say. Not from courage, he was also the man who handed over the bomb. Not from remorse, he never used the word. Not from justice, 2 people died who might have lived if he had stayed quiet. From something harder to name, the act of a man who had built himself around a standard, discovered he had violated it for 9 years and could not continue to be that person without acknowledging what that person had done. The bomb was built. The secrets were given. That is not heroism. It is not even redemption. It is just, at the very end, when the wall was down and the rubble was all that remained, honesty. The only thing he had ever actually believed in. Next time on Tradecraft. A fighter jet, 40,000 feet above the Sea of Japan. The pilot's name is Viktor Belenko. He is a Soviet Air Force lieutenant, 29 years old, one of the most skilled MiG-25 pilots in the Pacific Fleet. He has planned this moment for months, alone, in secret, telling no one. No handler, no CIA contact, no network waiting on the other side. On September 6, 1976, he breaks formation, drops to low altitude to avoid Soviet radar, and points his aircraft toward Japan. He lands at a civilian airport in Hakodate. He climbs out of the cockpit. He asks for the Americans. What he brought with him, the MiG-25, the most feared Soviet aircraft in the Western inventory, the plane NATO had built entire defensive doctrines around, would take American and Japanese engineers 25 days to disassemble and assess. What they found inside changed everything the West thought it knew about Soviet technology. But the aircraft is not the story. The story is what happens to a man who gets exactly what he wanted and discovers that freedom is not the same as belonging. Viktor Belenko, the pilot who stole a MiG, next time on Tradecraft.